Well, the publican's a businessman, he don't care who you are. The only thing that makes him smile is 3 deep at the bar. Now look out for the funny drunk, a regular heart and soul. Always give him a little rein, but you got to keep control. Working in the suburbs, working Parramatta, working in the country, it really doesn't matter. Making people happy, like singing at a party. Chapter 11. Now look out for the funny drunk, a regular heart and soul. In 1971, I moved to Sydney. At the time, a friend of a friend was sharing a large flat overlooking the Pacific Ocean at Coogee. Luckily, there was a spare room available, so I moved in and quickly got to know the Chines. That is, a bunch of Western Sydney blokes who were all the China plates or mates, which became the Chines. They included a TAB manager, a Rothmans salesman, a taxi driver, and an air steward. We all got on extremely well. There were never any squabbles over the contents of the fridge or tidiness. The Sydney-born fellas showed me the ropes of Sydney life. Never the farm girl type, Mary Kay moved to Sydney to study nursing at Royal North Shore Hospital. It was a hugely social time for us. Wine bars had become the latest thing. We graduated from Cold Duck to Benin Moselle. I've often wondered how the upper crust of Sydney society knew about the great still wines from the Barossa and Hunter while we were drinking such crap. But at least we had broken away from Lindeman's sparkling porphyry pearl. The only way to keep my career going was to find a club agent and work the cabaret circuit. In reality, there was no circuit. It all came down to how many clubs your agent managed the entertainment for. If your agent managed 10 clubs, it would give him or her leverage with other agents who looked after another 10 clubs. So they would trade acts, as they called us. All I needed was a 40-minute show. There would always be a comedian as compere and maybe a performing act or jugglers or acrobats. Sometimes a club would have resident dancing girls to kick a show off. No pun intended. There was a regular club band to back your show, and I generally had to use that band whether I liked it or not. Some of them were woeful impostors, and some were the best musos in the world. Working the clubs was bread and butter for hundreds of musicians, dancers, singers and performers. I'd go through the music charts with the band half an hour before the show started, making sure they were aware of repeats and so on. Then I'd keep my fingers crossed. In fairness, though, there were a few club bands that were excellent. I always knew the competent musicians by how much attention they paid to the run-through of the music charts. I soon learned that the less notice they took of what I was saying, the worse the musicians. It wasn't advisable to do original songs, so there were many standard songs that everyone sang. The bands usually guessed their way through the charts because they knew the songs anyway. I can't imagine what a mess they would have made of some of the songs I would go on to write, like Galleries of Pink Galahs and Cootamundra Wattle. I wish I had stolen the sign in the dressing room at Manny Lee's club. The sign read, "The artist must thank the band at the end of the performance." The old band leader there ruled the roost. Once again, the worse the band leader, the more arrogant he was. I was adding songs to my show that the bands had never heard of, and that was a problem because they couldn't bluff their way through like they could with the many standard songs. So while this was a great period for me to learn to be an entertainer, musically it was quite debilitating. Agents just didn't want to know about original songs. Dick Buchanan was a muso who was an expert at writing out charts that were very simple to follow, using different colours on coders and repeat signs and so on. He was recommended to me, so I took my songs and medleys to him. I made up my own medleys, but many artists used his charts, so my best medley of Roger Miller or Johnny Cash songs ended up being used by other country singers. Such was the incestuous nature of the club scene. Eventually, I hired Alan Tompkins, a bass player, as my musical director. He would discuss the charts with the band, and if they were hopeless, we could hold the show together on our own. It was always clear to me that the cabaret scene would eventually become same old, and that it would die. If you ever did cover a song that was different, It wouldn't be long before someone else copied it. One of my first shows in Sydney after moving from Melbourne was at the Coogee Bay Hotel. I was booked to sing for 40 minutes. This big Chicago-type resident band was very helpful. They were a great bunch and very entertaining. The other guest artist was Maria Venuti. I was new on the scene with my one hit, and Maria was very encouraging. I will never forget that, and I've told Maria since. I remembered her act of kindness some years later when I felt it was my turn to encourage a new artist at the Chevron Hotel in Melbourne. A young Marcia Hines was just starting her solo career. What a contrast. Old Man Emu following Marcia. I'll never forget how magic she was. Her whole body was in rhythm with the music, and she sounded and looked gorgeous. I remember being booked to sing at Balmain RSL Club in Sydney very early in this period. It was a Sunday smoko morning, men only. I knew this was seen as an opportunity to be rude, foul, dirty, you name it. The comedian's first words that morning was fuck, so I planned to do only my best songs and take the money. Anything rude I had was so mild in comparison that they would have ignored me. An old English song called Chastity Belt was always a winner with a mixed audience, but it was a bit naughty and big ears for this mob. Come to think of it, any of the risque songs I've ever sung have always amused the women more than the men. The vasectomy song, which I wrote in the late 80s, always had the older women in breathless, raucous laughter. But even that one would have needed more foul language on this Balmain morning. My songs went over well enough. I was singing some John Denver, Roger Miller, Johnny Cash, and the always successful Old Man Emu. The club manager that morning, I'll make the names up here, said, "Well, this next young fella I'm going to bring on was recommended by Ronnie Patterson at Canterbury Leagues Club, so he's no fucking good, you can blame him." Such was the beginning of my club experiences. They certainly taught me to expect the unexpected. Another memorable occasion was at a club in the Hunter Valley. I had a bass player and a guitarist with me, and I set up my own sound system. I sang a few songs, with Old Man Emu being the highlight of the set. About halfway through, this silly old bugger stood up and yelled, "I know what all those fancy boxes are," referring to the Bose speakers. "They're playing the music, you're just miming." The audience reacted by looking at me as if they thought this was true. So I immediately stopped singing, but still moved my lips as if I was miming. The musos cracked up behind me. Still playing the guitar, I walked over to the speaker, kicked it, and then started singing again. The audience woke up to the joke and pissed themselves. I recall being quite flattered that we must have sounded just like the recording. Working in the clubs taught me how to handle smart-asses and inattentive crowds. Often there would be one mug in an audience who just had to draw attention to himself. Most of the time it was better to ignore the prick because it usually only encouraged him to carry on. If it became so distracting, my first line, I borrowed it from somewhere, was to say, "Listen, mate, up here you're a clown, down there you're the village idiot." This always got a laugh. If that didn't work, the next thing was to get serious and get the audience behind me. "Listen, mate, if you don't want to listen, go home. These people have paid good money to come to the show." This usually brought a good response from the crowd with, "Yeah, mate, sit down and shut up." This in turn would cause a reaction from the club security guys who would stand quite close, hoping to get the chance to throw the prick out. You never want that to happen, though, as it's likely to stir support for the offender because security guys are rarely popular. The next thing you know, the idiot's mate will want to punch the security blokes, and then it's chaos. It's very hard to bring the magic of the show back after all that. People go away talking about how this silly old drunk got thrown out and caused a fight, and probably forget that up to that point, I was entertaining them. Back in those early days, I also had to deal with the rudeness of the club personnel themselves. It used to shit me how the club manager and about 20 of his friends usually occupied the biggest table at the front. Inevitably, they were on freebies, all blowing smoke on me and often talking. One such lot at Queanbeyan Leagues Club invited me to sit with them for a beer after the show. The overweight manager noticed that I had cassettes for sale. I probably sold 10 at the most on average. He said, "Well, my mate over here will have one. Mavis would like one, and hey, Bill, you want one?" Well, my hackles went up immediately. I calmly said, "Sorry, but I don't give my cassettes away." "Well, you'll never work this club again, mate," was his reaction. I don't think I have worked that club ever again, but I've worked in many other venues in the Canberra area. Come to think of it, the last time I worked a club in Queanbeyan, I filled the room on a door deal and was paid about half. Very dodgy agent, very dodgy club. Sorry, Queanbeyan, it's not your fault. In the old days, it helped to piss in the pockets of managers and agents, but I wouldn't do it. My job has always been to put bums on seats. That's the way to win. The Mo Awards recognise achievements in live entertainment in Australia, and a category was introduced years ago for the most successful attraction of the year. I won it 3 years in a row, after which the award didn't exist. I called it the Bums on Seats Award because the theatre and club managers voted on it. Oddly, I've never received an Entertainer Award when I reckon that is the most important aspect of my career. I went from club agent to club agent in the 70s. They had the scene locked up. Agents would look after each other's artists by doing deals amongst themselves, and I reckon that's why the scene virtually died. The public became tired of the same acts coming to their club. In those early days, the shows were often free for members, so the punters weren't always looking for value for money. Nowadays, a club has to pay the artist to get quality. Either that, or we take the door. I'd rather sing to an audience who want to listen any day. If they paid money, they won't tolerate others spoiling it for them. We've come a long way since the days of competing with pokies in the same room as the show. Back then, many of the auditoriums still had poker machines at the back that made an awful racket. However, I have to admit that if it wasn't for the RSL, bowling, golf and leagues clubs in New South Wales, I might never have developed as an entertainer. The club scene was an eye-opener for this bush boy. That period of my career was about learning what you have to do to keep the audience's interest. It's the ability to entertain along with originality that keeps your head above others. You can have a great voice, great songs, but without the ability to stir the emotions of an audience, you might as well sing in the shower.